Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Jim Waller. I'm the acting director of the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute and a professor of literatures, cultures, languages, and human rights here at UConn. And thrilled that you're able to join us today. We know it's the next to last week of classes, so people have a lot of things going on, but we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. This is our annual Genocide Awareness Lecture. We hold this lecture every April in recognition of International Genocide Awareness Month. That's a month that has been designated because it coincides with the anniversaries of several major acts of genocide and other acts of mass violence, but it gives us a time each year to commemorate victims, to honor survivors, and educate the public to prevent future atrocities and hopefully make never again a reality. Today's lecture is going to focus on a conflict that has had profound global consequences, the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's now in its fifth year, but its roots run nearly a century of an ongoing conflict and crisis. This ongoing crisis we live in today has affected not only regional dynamics in Eastern Europe, but it's also influenced international relations, economic stability, and humanitarian conditions worldwide. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from someone who brings valuable insight to this complex and evolving situation. Our speaker has spent significant time studying and analyzing the historical roots, geopolitical dynamics, and human consequences of this war. Through her work, she helps us move beyond the headlines and toward a deeper comprehension of what's at stake, both regionally and globally. After the end of her presentation, which will be about 45 minutes, we'll have the final 15 minutes or so for Q&A time, so please be thinking of questions as the presentation goes along. I'm very pleased to introduce a friend and colleague, Dr. Kristina Hook, to reintroduce her because she was here in 2023 as part of our summit on the global assault on democracy. And she's also been back another time for a workshop we did on atrocity prevention. Dr. Hook is an assistant professor of conflict management in the School of Conflict Management, Peace Building and Development at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. By training, she's an anthropologist who specializes in genocide and mass atrocity, and she's worked in more than 30 countries across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Middle East, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. Dr. Hook's conducted extensive field work in Ukraine since 2015, something that she's very uniquely positioned to do. She's fluent in Ukrainian and Russian as well. She's a recipient of a 2004-25 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and author of a forthcoming book, which we're very excited about, titled When the Ukrainian Sun Rises, From the Holodomor to the Front Lines in Moscow's Century of Violence. That'll be published this coming fall by Georgetown University Press. Kristina's research and analysis have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, Genocide Studies and Prevention, Small Wars and Insurgencies, been featured on CNN, USA Today, and the Washington Post, among others. She's published more than 20 peer-reviewed works and over 40 policy reports and public commentaries on genocide and related topics. Her research on the Russia-Ukraine war has been cited by the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, NATO, the Parliamentary Assembly of Europe, and the U.S. government. In addition to her work as an anthropologist, she brings again another unique lens, having spent time in the U.S. State Department and understanding the front lines of policy making, policy decisions, and sometimes policy indecisions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hook, who will guide us through the realities, implications, and future outlook for the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Kristina?
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. It is a particular honor to be invited by Dr. Jim Waller. It is no exaggeration to say that his influence on the field has been transformational. And it is also a particular pleasure for me to be here as a guest of the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute. This is a very special community that I've enjoyed my time with you all over the last few years. So as we get into our topic today, I want to begin with a moment that in hindsight feels less like a warning and more like a missed turning point. In the years before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, I was there speaking with Ukrainian officials and leaders across many different fields: politics, law, civil society, academia, and they were all deeply attuned, as my introduction said, to patterns of Moscow's behavior towards Ukraine, past and present. I had first come to Ukraine in 2015 to speak with those who are active in memorializing the Ukrainian Holodomor. This beautiful picture is a picture of their national museum commemorating this event in 1932 to 33, when in just under 2 years, more than 4.5 million Ukrainians perished in an orchestrated famine under Joseph Stalin. But as we would discuss this history in beautiful places like this, the conversation would turn darker, and the conversation would turn to the south, and it would turn to the east. Even in these early years of my time in country from 2015 to 2021, it was impossible to ignore the daily impact of the armed conflict on the people of Ukraine. So at that time, this conflict was operating often below the headlines, but it was happening in a territory that was fairly large. So in 2014, Russia illegally annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, which is in the south of the country. And they also began to flood Ukraine's eastern region with military equipment and even regular Russian military personnel. And this was a large territory. For lacking in headlines, it was a territory, and just at that time, long before the escalation, that was bigger than the Netherlands, than Switzerland, than Denmark. So it was happening in a very large amount of territory. And what I would notice when these Ukrainian leaders would speak on it was the nature of their concerns and the nature of how their concerns were escalating. Long before 2022, these Ukrainian experts across all of these fields that I was speaking with and that I'd gathered to discuss history with were no longer speaking in abstractions. They were speaking about specific trends that they saw. They were talking about escalating repressions in the Crimean Peninsula and in occupied eastern Ukraine. They were talking about specific ideological narratives that were denying Ukrainian nationhood as legitimate and therefore denying Ukrainian national identity as legitimate. They were talking about the targeting of influential civic leaders in these spaces. And I think most disturbing in hindsight, there were even at that time rumors of small numbers of stolen children from occupied eastern Ukrainian orphanages. Let me show you a specific example of what people were telling me. In the photo, this is Yana Hrinko, the speaker of this quote, and she was at the time the exhibitions director of the museum I just showed you. So her words are worth considering. I'll take the luxury of our time together to read them out. So she says that she is a child of independent Ukraine. That is, she would have been born after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And she says, when her former president Yanukovych fled to Russia, it was so unexpected. And this Russian occupation of Crimea and the war in Donbass was so unexpected for me. But when I remembered the history of the Holodomor, I understood that Ukrainians should have foreseen this. What is now happening in Donbass and in Crimea is not the end of Russian encroachment towards Ukraine. Because nowadays, the Russian president denies the fact of the Holodomor as a genocide. Actually, he denies the existence of the Ukrainian nation as such. We all understand that the Holodomor occurred because Soviet authorities were afraid to lose Ukraine. They did not want it to stop being part of the Soviet Union. The Russian president, Putin, denies the existence of the Ukrainian modern state. They are constantly trying to take away our history. Such attempts to take away our history are very dangerous because in this case, we have a situation where one identity is put on another identity, and as a result, one identity assimilates to another one. We have to stand our ground. We do not have the right to forget about the Holodomor because it will take us to another genocide. Yana's words have proven tragically prescient in ways that affected her own family. I will never forget the very tense day when Yana's own grandmother was liberated. She had been under Russian occupation for more than a year after the full-scale invasion. And so, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this is a little snapshot of the situation. The blue areas are areas where Russia invaded and the territory has been liberated by Ukraine's military. This area with the jagged lines around it in the east is where the war was prior to 2022, and the red denotes the reality today. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, of course long before, but especially since 2022, there has been extensive documentation, many efforts to document Russian atrocity crimes, including some that I've been personally involved with and would be happy to speak about. And they're all pointing in our various ways of looking at this reality to patterns of coordinated and systematic violence as a Russian state policy against Ukrainian civilians that go beyond, far beyond incidental harm caused by conflict. So some of these include targeted attacks on Ukrainian residential areas and critical infrastructure, Russia's extensive and ever-growing use of what they call filtration systems that are used to detain and to screen Ukrainian civilians in the areas they occupy for indications of their commitment to their Ukrainian national identity. This has grown to the point where some of the people that I have documented, Ukrainian civilians trapped in these areas, have taken kitchen butter knives and tried to scrape off from their arm tattoos of things like wheat or maps of Ukraine that say home, because getting caught up in these filtration camps is usually a way that you are put into situations of torture and sexual violence. What has also been happening is echoing the sort of darker pages that we've seen with the Soviet bureaucratic machine of atrocities. So we've seen the forced deportation of Ukrainian civilians, most notably thousands of children, into Russia or Russian-controlled territory. Reports also document targeted violence against local leaders, and local leaders can include teachers in these areas, as well as the detention, torture, and violent coercion that is targeted along Ukrainian national identity lines in the occupied regions. So survivors and investigators have documented conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and other forms of abuse that are used to terrorize and that are also used in conjunction with rhetoric that talks about this as due to their Ukrainian identity, and it has targeted everyone from children to the elderly. Taken together, we argue in the work that I do that these actions reflect identifiable patterns that are tied to these ideological narratives first identified by people like Yana that are denying Ukrainian nationhood and practices that are aimed at erasing Ukrainian national identity. So this is raising sustained concerns that I've been a part of about the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even acts that are consistent with the legal definition of genocide. So when I look back at Yana's words and the extreme and even genocidal violence, when I look at her quote, she's talking about her fear that this would take them to another genocide. The headlines tell the story of how tragically prescient her concerns were. So the first picture I have here is the city sign of Mariupol. Mariupol was a city and is a city, it's still occupied by Russia in southeastern Ukraine. And it was kind of consistently voted in the country as one of the city's coziest cities. It's a seaside city and it has about 500,000 people, 450,000 people. And to this day, because it continues to be under Russian occupation, it is not clear how many civilians were killed. There is morgue data that's preserved on the Uppsala Conflict Data website that shows that perhaps 80,000 civilians were killed in the city alone, but it's still unclear. What is clear is what the Russian military and occupational authorities began to do immediately when they seized control of the city after sustained bombardment of it. And what they began to do immediately was not to protect civilians or try to stop the bleeding of the humanitarian crisis they had just caused, but it was to change the city signs. So Ukrainian and Russian are very different languages, and they also use different versions of the Cyrillic alphabet. But the word Mariupol is very similar. You might notice that the blue and yellow Ukrainian language has the letter I in it, and the Russian Cyrillic alphabet does not. But that was a glaring enough transgression that this is actually one of the first things that the Russian military began to do, was changing the sign to the Russian colors and removing any sort of vestiges of the Ukrainian language in this area. It's also been, for someone like me who works with, for so many years, people that document the Holodomor in Ukraine. Another thing that we've seen immediately is the destruction of memorials to this violence under Joseph Stalin in areas that Russia occupies today, as well as the targeted destruction across Ukraine of many things that kind of hold and preserve Ukraine's sense of identity. So museums, schools, anything like that. And then, of course, the last two pictures are quite hard, because whenever you are trying to target national identity, you of course have to target the people that carry and that bear and that transmit that kind of identity. And that is, of course, what we've seen. So when we think about all of this, when I take stock at what has unfolded in the sort of last 11 years that I've been working and living and working and conducting research in Ukraine, I think what struck me at the time that I was speaking with people like Yana, but perhaps even more so now, is not just what they were saying, but how difficult it was for those words to gain traction beyond Ukraine. So this is something that is from colleagues I respect very much, our good friends and colleagues at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. They do invaluable work for our field in a variety of ways. And they also do something called the Early Warning Project, which helps us kind of collectively as a field of scholars and experts and policymakers grapple with what we might be looking at year by year in terms of atrocity risks that we should be concerned about. And when I look at this map from 2022, I sort of look at it as a historical document. I sort of say, anthropologists love to say, where are the gaps? What weren't we listening to? And I think viewing this as a kind of historical document of its time is really striking for me. So I remember in 2022, one of the big things that had caused a lot of hope among Ukrainian legal professionals was that the International Criminal Court prosecutor had just announced the opening of investigations of crimes against humanity by Russia and Russia-linked perpetrators in occupied eastern Ukraine. But when we look at this kind of early warning systems as a historical document from 2022, what we can see is that neither the country of Ukraine is sort of flagged as a place of risk of atrocities, and it's up there in the sort of yellow section of Europe. It's undifferentiated as something that might be a trend that we should look for in 2022 as something to keep our eye on. And so I think it's important that we just sort of periodically take stock at what we are doing in this field, as committed as we all are, and ask some of the hard questions. And so tonight, I did want to begin our time with a question. What if the people that we most often describe as victims are in fact among the first to understand in precise and nuanced detail what is happening to them? And what if our failure is not just a failure to act, but it's also linked to this kind of fundamental failure of listening? And what are the implications of this? So this leads us, of course, to the problem of recognition. And I know many of us in this room probably are interested in different atrocities that are taking place in different contexts. And this problem of recognition and who counts as knowing is possibly a theme that is bringing your work to mind as well. In genocide studies and in policy assessments, we often speak about early warning systems as indicators, as risk assessments, or as escalation models. But I think what Ukraine has taught me that will stay with me for my career is that there was a different kind of failure that was happening. This was not that warning signs were absent. I want to point out some of this was working in Ukraine was a bit of the dawn of open source investigating that began to happen around the loss of a passenger air flight MH17 in the early years of the war that ended up being shot down by a regular Russian military unit. And so units like Bellingcat were kind of the first to very painstakingly document, here's a piece of Russian equipment that we've noticed in Russia. Now here it is across the border in Ukraine. And they were doing the same thing with also different Russian military personnel as well. It was the dawn of social media. So there's even pictures of Russian soldiers taking photos of themselves inside Ukraine in ways that could be documented. And it was such a known reality of Russia operating in the country that it became a source of dark humor and memes. I found an example for you on my phone. This is about a week after the annexation of Crimea. And there were all of these memes that were coming up, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia as well, where you would have these massive Russian war machines and missile systems that had no documented presence in Ukraine, now in sleepy villages. And so the sort of joke at the time was to post, like, where is this coming from? Just the local militia just happens to have its hand on things that you might expect the world's second largest military to also have. But on a more serious note, that was kind of channeling the social anxiety that was happening. It was very difficult at that time for that type of anxiety and that awareness of Russia's documented presence in the country to be talked about openly. We used to have to have a lot of conversations at the work that I would do, just sort of starting at the place that, no, this isn't an internal conflict, and begin in that sort of place. It has been much slower to have Russia's responsibility in the country acknowledged. But that doesn't mean it wasn't known. And so the problem remained that those who were recognizing the early warning signs were often discounted or ignored or just not part of the conversation. So it wasn't a failure of evidence in this particular case, but it was a failure of recognition. So I wanted to show you Kristina. Kristina is here on the screen, as you can see, and she was an open source investigative volunteer. I first met her in 2018. So using her skills in open source investigating, she had joined me for several very memorable trips that we made around the Kyiv region of Ukraine, and we were using her open source investigating skills and applying them to the historical reality. She and I would document the historical mass graves that some of whom hadn't really been documented from the Holodomor, from the Holocaust, and we're so grateful to have this documentation now of where local rumors or some kind of local blog would talk about this, because many of these historical mass graves for historical violence have now been disturbed by Russia's kinetic atrocity machine today. Many of these local sites of memory and even these graves themselves have now been bombed. And Kristina would also show me her hometown. She's from the eastern city of Kharkiv. And I remember one time we went there and we joined other researchers in the historical archives of Soviet violence in Ukraine, even as she was tracking Russia's ongoing investigation just miles to the east at the time. And she would give me books like this. I brought one today. She would give me books like this, like she's holding on the screen, that she would also give me. And it was very meticulously done. It was filled with QR codes, and it was filled with photos of all of the Russian equipment and personnel, the Russian presence in her country, documenting it with QR codes. And she would hand these books to me at the end of the kind of summer research that I would do. And she would say, like, please take this to the US Congress, like, please take this to the US Department of State. And of course, I would do so. Now, of course, all of her efforts to document these 8 long years of war have been vindicated. So Russia's invasion, aggression, and occupation are now publicly acknowledged, including in international courts. This headline is from February 2023 regarding a European Court of Human Rights ruling that had happened in January 2023. And in it, the European Court of Human Rights declared beyond reasonable doubt that Russian military forces were active in Ukraine from at least April 2014. The court further ruled that Russia held territory in Ukraine's eastern region under Russian jurisdiction since at least May 11, 2014, and that Russia was operating with a large-scale deployment of Russian troops in Ukraine since at least August of 2014. So her work has been vindicated, but of course, this was too late to prevent the full-scale invasion, the mass destruction of so much of Kristina's country, or to prevent Russia's explosion of violence in a war with a body count that I fear will top over 1 million people. And of course, it was too late to prevent the destruction from touching Kristina's life personally, as she lost her home and had to flee with her baby in her backpack when the full-scale invasion began. So this expertise and the impact of what you're observing becomes a very different thing. And that leads us to something that I think is important for us to think about. I know we probably do in many different cases, and that's this idea of what I like to think about as epistemic hierarchy, that knowledge that's often produced in the West, policy, or academic institutions is often treated as more objective. Knowledge that comes from those who are directly affected is often seen as partial, as emotional, and as therefore untrustworthy or as politically motivated. Now, when you do field work, there are always, at least for me, these moments that stop me in my tracks. And this was one of them. I took this photo in 2014 in downtown Kyiv, where the destroyed remnants of Russian tanks and other military equipments still sit in the downtown area. And it's perhaps bolstering collective resistance as the city faces sustained aerial bombardment night after night to this day. And in this picture, you can see how these military tanks and other things like that are interacted with by people that live there. It's very common practice to have people write the names of their destroyed hometowns on the outside of a destroyed Russian tank. And in this picture, you can see that the person has said, like this is for her city in the southern Kherson region, which is partially occupied today. And the moment that stops me in my tracks is this very stylish woman running up to the tank and writing in red lipstick the name of Mariupol, the city that I just talked with you about that was destroyed and that's still occupied today, and just releasing like an angry torrent of words at all of the people and places and safety and nature and animals that the Russians had taken from her. And she said finally, "This is Russia's legacy. My anger is a data point." And it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I think about that all the time, that her framing, I think, is so important for us to sit with. That her emotional reaction to the atrocities that had destroyed her life was perhaps the most rational response to what she had experienced, the clearest indicator that she was grappling with the holistic, lifelong impacts of genocide and atrocities. And for us who are willing to listen, maybe the entry point to understanding that holistic effect. I think that Ukraine also shows us this distinction between Western legitimacy and local knowledge is very misleading. It's very porous and very misleading. So in Ukraine, the people that were closest to the violence were not just reacting, they were analyzing. So immediately there were people who were identifying these ideological signals in Russia's state rhetoric. I showed you just how the exhibitions director at the museum, that the rhetoric was very important to her. She spoke at length on that. Ukrainians have also tracked these administrative and coercive practices in occupied territories. I've been shown records that have been released by the occupational Russian authorities that are so startling for those of us that spend our time in the Soviet archives, because there is a very, very, I think, intentionally similar degree of overlap between the Soviet archives and the way that that bureaucratic language is preserved now under the context of Russia's modern practice. And they understood how these past patterns were being reactivated in new forms. And people who understand these things are not just always what we would think of as the atrocity prevention professionals. So this is a picture of a Ukrainian literary writer, Victoria Amelina. And in this, I took this from her Twitter account. She says that, I'm a Ukrainian writer. I have portraits of great Ukrainian poets on my bag, and I really should be looking at pictures of books and art and my little son. But instead, I'm documenting Russian war crimes to the sound of shelling. Why? And so she had left behind her literary career, took her child to safety, left behind her literary career, and joined one of the Ukrainian organizations, Truth Hounds, that document Russian war crimes. And of course, people like her who have this literary background were reflecting the experiences that they were going through in these very poignant poems that I have up on the screen. But people like Kristina and like Victoria had their insights that were often being filtered out, not because they lacked evidence, but often because they lacked institutional authority. And that became not just a moral issue, it became a very practical issue of the failure to prevent. Because when we delay recognizing or deciding who is credible and who is not, we compress the window in which prevention is possible. So Victoria is someone that we miss terribly today because she was killed in a missile strike in eastern Ukraine in the context of the duties that she took onto herself as a volunteer war crimes investigator. So again, her insights did not correspond with the ability to protect. And that's something that, of course, her friends and family still live with. And so what I think I've also learned from this context is just that we should be very cautious with deciding who is credible based on maybe cultural quirks that we have, like emotional or not. And we should also be very careful about the way that we think about history. I'd like to suggest that history is not just memory, but history can be something that's like an analytic frame. And perhaps that's why people that are closest to these histories that they've lived see things first. So to understand, I think, why Ukrainian voices have been so consistently ahead of the curve, we should take seriously this role of historical experience and what that means in people's lives. Some of the regions that are hardest hit by Russia's full-scale invasion today along the front line are regions that were marked heavily by earlier genocides, both the Holodomor under Stalin and the Holocaust under Adolf Hitler. During the Holocaust, an estimated 1.2 to 1.6 million Jewish people who were living in Ukraine were killed. Often the Holocaust in this part of Europe was taking place in the form of mass shooting, and this legacy continues to this day. About 60% of Ukraine's Jewish community was killed during the Holocaust in this way in Ukraine alone. And this history is often acknowledged symbolically. I see this a lot with like political speech. It's often like a very symbolic, and it should help us think about the emotional weight of history. I want to suggest something a bit stronger. I think historical experience does not just produce memory, but it produces pattern recognition. So, communities that have experienced in their immediate family lines forced population transfers, identity erasure, state driven narratives of elimination, and other forms of genocidal violence may just be quicker to recognize when similar dynamics begin to emerge. And we should take that quickness seriously in a field like ours that thrives on reacting as quickly as possible. In Ukraine, this has meant an early recognition of filtration processes, which is something that dates back to Soviet practices, as well as to the Soviet practice of deportation under the Soviet Union, but as well as the historical role of the Russian Empire in taking children from the communities it targeted. Another sort of moment that stopped me in my tracks was a colleague showing me a painting that hangs in a Polish museum from the late 1700s, and it's called "The Abduction of Polish Children by the Muscovites," by the Moscow authorities. And so this has produced this pattern recognition of what's going on. And it's not to say that history determines interpretation, but I think we should consider carefully if it shapes analytical sensitivity. So I wanted to just very briefly give a couple examples of how I think history as an analytic frame might be showing up in this place where I work. And this is some of the just sort of snippets of public commentary by Ukrainian individuals. Olena is a prominent civil society activist, and this is her tweet from 2022, where she is talking about Russia's sustained campaign to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure. That's something that we have seen the International Criminal Court issue arrest warrants for some of the Russian military commanders involved, but it hasn't necessarily translated into any kind of practical protective impact on the ground. The winter that we've just come from was the worst winter that Ukrainians have experienced, as the temperature was kind of historically cold. It's very common for it to be sub-zero, and now at this stage, every Ukrainian power plant has sustained damage or been destroyed. But even in 2022, she was immediately talking about how Russia was destroying the conditions needed to sustain Ukrainian life, and she did so by invoking the Holodomor. And we also see this coming from the chain of politics. So this is one of, at the time, the most senior advisors in the Ukrainian presidential office, and he's writing for a Western audience in the news, and he has a picture of the Holodomor Museum, and he's talking about how this can fuel Ukrainian resistance. So I think history is perhaps a source of strength internally, but also pattern recognition to ask what you're truly facing is something that I've seen. I've also seen this come up in very specific ways with the ways that I've heard Ukrainians talk about the historical pattern of evacuations being targeted. So this is something that I'm just intimately familiar with because I came to Ukraine to study the Holodomor. And one of the ways that we talk about this being an artificial famine is because the Soviets, like so many other perpetrators, kept very detailed records of some of the things that they were doing in 1932 and 1933. I want to say that this picture is not a picture from Ukraine in 1932-33. This is a picture of an example. We have very few photos from that time. But what we do have very detailed records that are preserved from that time is Soviet authorities counting how many fleeing Ukrainian peasants they would catch, trying to flee their artificially induced famine-affected villages, and they would catch them at train stations, bring these people back to their villages, post soldiers outside the village, and wait for people to die. And so that's the sort of level of intentionality we're talking with. And I've seen that really shape how Ukrainians feel about evacuation, how Ukrainians feel about this role that evacuation is not a sort of sacred humanitarian ground for Moscow perpetrators. I've seen that very much in their discourse. And then finally, just the way that we have seen very similar patterns to a degree that's just really startling, that we see in other genocides but have a particular kind of resonance in the Ukrainian context. This is another one of the records that I personally worked with when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, where you would have these correspondences between Joseph Stalin and his inner circle calling Ukraine a bacteria that's eating away at us. And the Russian rhetoric today has just kind of subtly upgraded that to call Ukraine intestinal parasites, or a mad animal that must be put down, or to say that I won't rest until Ukraine no longer exists. And so this kind of rhetoric has been also a continuity that we have seen, and that made Ukrainians really attuned to these signals that this discourse was given, and very much wanting to predicate their actions on the reality that they believe that they are facing, which is their militarily powerful neighbor calling for their destruction and elimination. And so during this time, I did a residency. During this time of the full-scale invasion, I did a residency in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful city. And at that time, I was working with many other Ukrainians who were active in documenting things. I also had time spent working with the family of Victoria Melina to put her final writings together as a book. And it was a very formative time for us all. And one of the conversations that we used to have was this clear example of the connection between experience and expertise. And so to think about the legal concepts that we relied on to understand mass violence today were forged by individuals who have this connection to the region and who are responding to the destruction around them. So as my slide says, the modern legal language of atrocity, two of the major categories of crime that we use today, genocide and crimes against humanity, were developed by individuals who have legal connections and law school connections to the same city, Lviv, which is now in present-day Western Ukraine. And I don't think that this is incidental. Many historians who look at the kind of biographies of these individuals have asked questions that cause us to think, is legal innovation in fact shaped by lived proximity to mass violence? And that these thinkers began to draw on different lessons from this mass violence while even being reflected and refracted by this mass violence in specific ways. And I think what that has also taught me is that Ukraine is not just a site where crimes may be occurring, it is also a place that has helped teach the world how to name them and how to categorize them and how to work through the thorny issues of the very particular and specific dynamics. So as we think about these lived experiences of mass violence, I think it's also important to make sure that we're continually checking our thinking and updating our thinking, to talk about the people that are experiencing these kind of atrocities and genocide as beyond victimhood, and to think about their agency under conditions of violence. This is often a persistent limitation that I'm sure you have talked about in your classes here. And it's a very thorny issue. Victimhood is real and it must be acknowledged, but it is not often the whole story. And I chose this photo because I wanted to remember to tell you a story about it. So one of my colleagues, my Ukrainian academic colleagues, on the day of Russia's full-scale invasion, began to work as a fixer for international news hubs that were there on the border. And the border was very chaotic. In the first months of Russia's full-scale invasion, about 8 million refugees fled Ukraine. And when we talk about that, it was primarily women and children, because men under the age of 65 are not allowed to leave the country. And so it was primarily just millions of women and children. And what my friend talks about, just sort of being a local fixer for these international news crews, is their search. They were searching and searching for what they thought would be the picture that would help maybe Western audiences to connect. And the picture they most wanted was a woman crying with her children. They were like looking for a woman crying. And as my friend tells the story, she's like, we got millions of women and all of them are just angry. They're just so irate at what Russia is doing. They're not crying. They're just so furious. And every interview that people will listen, they're furious at what's happening, that they have to leave their husband, their adult sons, their dads, like furious that Russia's causing that in their life, furious for their fear of their children. And so they were never able to find the crying mother, right? They were finding these faces of women acting with agency under the conditions of violence that were forced upon them. And so in Ukraine, we see this clear examples of this complexity with grappling with this suffering narrative. And we see people under attack acting as first responders, as investigators, and as rescuers. So, one of the clear ways that we can see this is this issue of abducted children in Ukraine. So, the forced transfer of children, as this room well knows, is explicitly prohibited under the Genocide Convention. It is one of the clearest legal indicators of genocide when it corresponds with intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. And it is also a very serious issue that is shaping realities in Ukraine today. So, Russian authorities claim in their rhetoric to have taken 700,000 Ukrainian children. It's unclear if that's accurate. It's unclear if that type of rhetoric is intended as a sort of a rhetoric of terror. Ukrainian authorities have verified the identities of over 20,000 children who have been taken from various Ukrainian communities. The Russian government has done their very best from the start to prevent these children returning home. They have passed legislation that legalizes the adoption of these children into families, and often, especially early, these were families with ties to the Russian government. And there have been many, many steps that we have documented where the Russian government has changed the names of the children, and then they realized that we were still sort of tracking the children through birth dates of the ones who would be old enough to know their birth date. So then they started changing even the birth dates of the children, hiding them in the system. This is also one of the issues for this war that, even as I think many things about Ukraine have passed out of the headlines, it seems to me that this is still one of the issues that receives the most international attention. And I'm very grateful for that, right? Because attention on any of these cases of atrocities that we care about has the possibility of political will. And there are many political statements that are made about this issue today. But when we look at who is solving the issue, 90% of successful child rescues have been carried out by Ukrainians themselves, according to our child protection colleagues at Georgetown. This is the striking reality that the overwhelming majority of actual rescues of these children has been carried out by families, volunteers, and civil society networks. So they're tracking these deportations. There was recently just a hackathon to try and trace. They ended up locating 45 children this week who were being passed around the system. They're navigating these dangerous routes. Many Ukrainians they speak Russian sometimes, and so using that kind of specialized knowledge, negotiating migration crossing, how to get in, how to hide and getting out, and documenting cases. And sometimes these roles are very porous. There was a case where some Ukrainian journalists went to try and document a case, and they ended up being able to rescue that child. They were able to maintain contact with this teenage child and get that child through the sort of underground network back into safety. What I want to suggest is that this isn't just, these kind of stories of resilience, but actually this is operational capacity. This is a skill that is needed to make a difference in the lives of these children who have been taken, and it is coming from the society. It's also changing fundamentally, I think, how we think about issues in scholarly literature about rescue. So often we think about people who leave behind their possibility of safety and go and rescue atrocity crime victims. But in this case, we actually see rescue being carried out by Ukrainians who have been victimized by other types of atrocity crimes, such as aerial bombardment of civilian areas, and then go and play a role in rescuing their fellow citizens. So, this is, of course, very inspiring, and I think that it's worth pausing for that. So I have seen Ukrainian civilians organize evacuation networks very sensitive to the realities that those would be targeted. I've seen local actors like Victoria Amelina document war crimes. I've seen communities maintain this mutual aid under extreme conditions. But part of the reality there is that they are doing that because, relative to the size of what is unfolding, there are still very few international actors in Ukraine. There are international volunteers. There are some international volunteers who have joined the military, but of the sort of official actor presence, they're often pretty small diplomatic missions who left the country and came back, or they're small, perhaps multilateral presences like the UN monitoring mission. But of people who have a mandate to protect or a mandate to rescue, that is something that Ukrainian society has taken on solely on themselves. And this raises a difficult question and that is, what does it mean when those targeted by mass violence are performing the functions that the international system is designed, but often fails to carry out? So what does it mean when the victims are bearing a full burden of prevention, documentation, and recovery? And so it's not just a story of courage, and we have to be careful there. It's also a story of substitution. So when I sort of look back at what I've learned from these places, the difficult questions it raises, as well as the things that I'm learning from the communities that I work with, I think it's also important to talk about how this leads to faster response times, as well as this kind of continuing prescience about the future. So, of the many kind of horrors and particular specific atrocity crimes I could have talked about today, one of them involves technology and the changing landscape. And so some of us talked about that this morning in my workshop, but it's also important to, I think, talk about in this context of local expertise. So one of the issues that has been going on, particularly in the south of Ukraine, is what local communities there call a human safari. And that's where individual Russian drone pilots, often using first-person view drones with a sort of headset where you can see where you're flying it, is targeting civilians in a very coordinated way. There are specific sort of menus of people they should target. So you get this much if you target an old man, this much if you target an old woman, this much if you get a rescue personnel, this for a child. And it's very, very disturbing in its detachment and dehumanization. It's also very striking because it's not just about the violence itself, but it's about the speed at which it is understood and responded to by those experiencing it. So we've seen so many civilian adaptations, changing movement patterns, developing these informal early warning systems, documenting attacks in real time, meanwhile grappling with a very slow legal framework that's struggling to keep pace, accountability mechanisms lag, and protection mechanisms for the people actually affected by this remaining very, very limited. And so again, we're seeing this gap, which I think might actually go back to some of the conversations of these terms of genocide and crimes against humanity coming from people affected by violence in this region. Those closest to violence are often the fastest to understand its nature and fastest to understand its implications. One of the things that has just also stayed with me is the sadness, I would say it's sadness of many, many former civilians who have had to join Ukraine's military. That's the kind of only option to protect their families at this point. And one of the things that they have said is, as we have to iterate this technological advance over and over and over again, the iteration of technology upgrade is about 2 to 3 weeks. They often say, like, what are we unleashing on the world? This is not something that will stay in Ukraine. And so that is because, of course, and unfortunately, local expertise and understanding does not automatically translate into protection. And I think that this is important just to sit with for a moment. Just because you're right doesn't mean that you'll be listened to. And just because you have the evidence to accurately speak of what is happening to you and what the future risks are does not mean that you will be protected by people that have the power to act. And I think perhaps one of the reasons that Ukraine has been so effective at teaching me this lesson is because it has been teaching this lesson for a very long time. Allow me to introduce you to Lysia Ukrainka. She is one of Ukrainian literature's foremost writers. She's known for her poems and her plays, and she was born in 1871 and she died in 1913. She is such a well-known figure in Ukrainian society today that I couldn't resist sharing with you this pen that my Ukrainian journalist friend gave me last summer. I'll show it to you in greater detail after the talk, but it's Lysia Ukrainka, stylized as Wonder Woman today. And so she's continuing to be this kind of influential figure even in pop culture today. And what I think is the connection here is the way that some of these themes that I've talked about tonight are themes that go much, much further back in the way that Ukrainian society has grappled with the world around them. Cassandra of Troy is a well-known figure of mythology. I'm sure you know her, and she helps illuminate this problem. In classical mythology, she was granted the ability to foresee catastrophe, but she was cursed to never be believed. And in 1917, Lysia Ukrainka updated this version. In her retelling, she imagined Cassandra not as a mad prophet, not as a kind of mystic or not as an irrational person, but as a clear-eyed analyst, someone who understands exactly what is unfolding, but who is analytical and precise and perceptive. But the tragedy in Lysia Ukrainka's retelling in 1907 is that those around her refuse to act on what is already known. This reinterpretation has always felt strikingly contemporary, even though it is almost 120 years old. In Ukraine, most of the warnings that we now recognize as prescient were not particularly hidden. They were articulated carefully, repeatedly, with evidence and with QR codes, as I showed you, by those closest to unfolding violence. And yet, like Cassandra in Ukrainka's retelling, they were often not believed in time to protect them. Cassandra's curse is often misunderstood as a personal tragedy, was one of the main messages for Lysia Ukrainka. In her writing, we can understand this as a structural failure, a failure of recognition. Cassandra speaks the truth, but she lacks the authority to make it legible within her society. And I think that this dynamic is not necessarily confined to myth, but it's hinting at something that we should grapple with. It's visible in how warnings from those who are closest to violence and mass atrocities are filtered, discounted, or delayed in international response systems. And this, of course, leads us to something that is also very well known in many cases that we work on, and that is the politics of naming and the costs of delay. The politics of naming have impacted Ukrainian experiences sharply, not failing to name Russia's involvement in the country or the struggle to name current atrocities, the removal of the issue of atrocities from the news to sort of focus on the war as only over something of territory or this amorphous battle line. Over and over and over again, though, in my notes from 2015 until the full-scale invasion, I would see the sensitivity of warning among the Ukrainian experts that I was talking with. They were very sensitive to patterns, to signals, and to trajectories, and they were often identified very early. This is another interview excerpt by someone I'll call Yulia. She is a journalist, so I want to protect her identity today due to the danger of that role. But in October of 2018, she told me, I think the role of the Holodomor is to teach us that there is nothing holy when you have one country occupy another. We see it now, there is nothing untouchable here, even humans' lives, even millions of humans' lives. And that's our weapon. We should be strong and defend our culture, our values, and our borders to avoid that. We should learn. We can cry a lot, but it will not help. We should learn from that. The main lesson is that it is a lesson. It's a sacrifice our predecessors had to pay for us to understand that it should never happen again in any country of the world. And so this kind of lesson and the sensitivity of even the fear of occupation, which has happened in the Ukrainian context. And so as we wrap up, I want to return to the question that I asked, the question I posed at the beginning. What if those we call victims are among the first to know? Ukraine suggests that they often are. They are the experts in early warning, they are the interpreters of pattern, and they are the agents of response. And yet the systems that we often rely on for prevention and accountability are not always designed to fully recognize or to incorporate that expertise. And so perhaps the challenge is not just to fiddle around with improving our tools, better data, better institution, better laws, but it's also to rethink some of our foundational assumptions about where knowledge resides. When asked to describe genocide survivors, I think this room would answer differently. But if we were to ask the general public, many people might suggest words like wounded, fragile, traumatized. Or if you Google genocide survivor, I think you might see pictures of scars, tears, like the story I told you about crying mothers, scars, tears, and desperation, indexing the centrality of themes like broken or perhaps even beyond repair. But I think without negating what has been done unjustly to genocide and atrocity survivors, we need to think about their hard fought and their hard preserved knowledge. And we need to begin to see them with all due sensitivity as individuals and communities that are ordinary people that have been forced to live extraordinary lives, who, although lacking control over the circumstances of their abuse, have become some of the world's foremost experts in adaptation and resilience and in recovery. They are contributors, and I think it's very important that we think about what that means to the systems that we work in. if we continue to treat those who are targeted by mass violence primarily as sources of suffering or pathos or even just well-intentioned sympathy, I think we will continue to arrive too late to prevent, too late to respond, and too late to fully understand what has been seen clearly by those who were closest to it in the first place. If there is a modern Cassandra in Ukrainian story, it's not an individual person. It's that many Ukrainians saw what was coming and who said so clearly and with evidence in my field notes and elsewhere many years before the full-scale invasion. And so I think as we continue to listen to them and their insistence on being safe in the long term from Russia, or their concern about Russia's intentions for their country, as the United Nations has measured the highest rates of civilian casualties last year since 2022, I think we need to listen. We need to believe. It's not really the question about whether Ukrainians or other atrocity victims speak to us. It's whether we're prepared to listen, to believe, to evaluate, and to act. And I think what we do about that every day. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions, and I believe that we'll have a microphone that's being circulated now.